The grand ballroom of the London townhouse shimmered like a gilded cage, every surface polished to a blinding gleam to reflect the worth of its inhabitants. Candlelight danced across jewels that spoke of ancient lineages and new fortunes, while the air, thick with the scent of beeswax and expensive perfume, hummed with the low murmur of calculated conversation. It was a world built on the unshakable foundation of pedigree and pound sterling, a world into which Elara Thornfield did not truly belong. She stood near a marble column, a study in quiet contrast to the vibrant silks and boisterous laughter surrounding her. Her gown, though neat and well cared for, was fashioned from a simpler stuff, its deep blue hue the only claim to elegance she could afford. Her presence there was a tenuous thing, secured by the distant kindness of a relation who had taken pity on her intellectual yearnings. It was this very yearning that had drawn her gaze across the room, past the swirling dancers and preening peacocks, to the man standing aloof by the great fireplace. Duke Alistair Blackwood was a figure known more by reputation than by sociability. Tall and austerely handsome, with dark hair swept back from a thoughtful brow, he observed the spectacle with an air of detached amusement that bordered on disdain. He was an island in the sea of society, and Elara felt an unexpected kinship with his solitude. While others saw only his title and his fortune, she noted the intelligence in his observant eyes, the way his fingers absently traced the spine of a book left forgotten on the mantelpiece. Fate, or perhaps the simple need for a momentary escape from the stifling crowd, orchestrated their collision. As Elara moved to find a quieter corner, the press of bodies shifted, and she found herself unexpectedly near the Duke's solitary post. Her eyes fell upon the book he had been touching, a volume of John Stuart Mill. The words were out before she could consider the audacity of addressing a duke unbidden, her voice a soft intrusion into his silence. She remarked on the radical nature of the text for such a conservative setting. Alistair Blackwood turned, his expression not one of annoyance, but of genuine surprise. He had expected another simpering compliment or a veiled inquiry into his marital status. Instead, he was met with a keen observation, delivered with a calm certainty that belied the speaker's modest appearance. He responded not as a duke to an inferior, but as one mind to another, and a conversation unfolded there by the fireside, a quiet eddy in the roaring river of the ball. They spoke of literature, of ideas that challenged the very foundations of the society swirling around them. Elara, forgetting her place entirely, spoke with a passion and insight that she normally kept guarded. She revealed a mind honed by voracious reading and independent thought, a mind unburdened by the conventional prejudices of her class. Alistair listened, truly listened, his own responses deepening, challenging her in turn. He found himself intrigued, not by her beauty, though she possessed a quiet loveliness in her animation, but by the sheer force of her intellect. Here was a woman who saw the world not as a hierarchy to be climbed, but as a complex tapestry to be understood. It was a revelation, a breath of fresh air in the perfumed stagnation of his usual social obligations. He was captivated by the clear, unflinching light of her mind, a light that shone all the brighter against the dim backdrop of her lower social standing, a standing that, for the first time, felt like the most irrelevant detail in the room. The weeks that followed the ball unfolded like a series of carefully composed vignettes, each new social gathering offering another stolen moment, another layer of understanding. Alistair Blackwood, once a spectre at the edge of every function, now seemed to have a new purpose for his attendance. His eyes would scan the room with a quiet intensity until they found Elara, a fixed point of calm intelligence in the chaotic sea of frivolity. He would seek her out, not with the boisterous entitlement of other suitors, but with a deliberate grace that made her feel chosen, not chased. Their conversations, which had begun with literature, soon deepened, branching into the turbulent waters of philosophy and sharp-edged societal critiques. In the shadowed alcoves of crowded drawing rooms, or amidst the manicured symmetry of garden parties, they built a world of their own, a fortress of ideas. Ilara felt the fragile bud of hope begin to unfurl within her chest. Each encounter left her mind buzzing and her heart feeling perilously light. She found herself studying the curve of his smile when he grasped a complex point she made, the way he would lean in slightly, as if fearful of missing a single syllable. It was a courtship of the mind, and for a woman whose aspirations had always been forced into the narrow confines of needlework and pleasant conversation, it was intoxicating. She began to imagine a future that was not a compromise, but a collaboration, a life where her thoughts were not merely tolerated, but cherished. Yet the real world was never far away, its whispers slithering through the cracks in their intellectual sanctuary. The rumors about the Duke's financial straits were no longer mere hints, but open secrets, discussed with feigned sympathy over teacups. The pressure for him to make a prudent match, to secure his ancient title with new money, was a constant, unspoken guest at every event. Ilara heard the name Lady Beatrice repeated with a significant weight, a name synonymous with vast coal mines and an unassailable social position. Each whisper was a cold splash of reality against the warm hope she nurtured, a reminder that in the economy of their world, intellect held no currency against a well-stocked ledger. It was during a quiet walk in Hyde Park, a rare moment of near solitude afforded by an overcast afternoon, that the conflict within her heart reached its peak. Alistair had arranged the meeting with a discretion that felt both thrilling and ominous. The air was cool, smelling of damp earth and impending rain. They spoke little, the comfortable silence between them more eloquent than words. As they paused by the Serpentine, watching the grey water ripple under the breeze, his hand brushed against hers. The contact was fleeting, accidental, yet it sent a jolt through her entire being. Her heart fluttered wildly, a trapped bird beating against the cage of her ribs, a sensation so powerful it stole her breath. In that moment, the whispers faded, the societal calculations evaporated, and all that existed was the electric possibility of his nearness. She allowed herself to believe, if only for the span of a heartbeat, that a man might choose a companion for her mind and the unspoken language of a shared glance. But as a drop of rain landed on her cheek, cold and definitive, the reality of her position washed over her once more. She was a woman of modest means and grand ideas, dreaming in a world that sold dreams to the highest bidder. The heavy oak door of the Blackwood study closed with a soft, final click, sealing Alistair inside with the ghost of his family's legacy and the grim arithmetic of its decline. The room, a cavern of dark wood and leather, smelled of old books and older money, a scent that now seemed tinged with the acrid odor of desperation. Outside, the London morning was bright, but in here, the light struggled through leaded windows, falling in dusty shafts upon the desk where his advisor, Mr. Finchley, had spread the damning ledgers. The columns of numbers, neat and pitiless, told a story of reckless ancestors, failing investments, and the slow, inexorable bleed of an estate that was all title and no substance. Mr. Finchley, a man whose face was as pinched and careful as his accounting, had just delivered his summation. The words hung in the air, more solid than the cigar smoke that curled towards the ceiling. The Blackwood fortune was not merely diminished. It was a hair's breadth from collapse. Creditors, once patient out of respect for the name, were growing restless. The roof at the country seat needed repairs that would cost a king's ransom. And the solution, according to Finchley's unassailable logic, was not to be found in better investments or stricter economies, but in a single strategic alliance. Lady Beatrice, Finchley had said, his voice devoid of any sentiment save for pragmatic urgency. Her father's interests in the north are boundless. A union there would not only clear the debts, but ensure the Blackwood line for generations. It is the only course, Your Grace. Alistair had turned his back to the man, staring out at the sun-dappled square below. He saw carriages passing, people living their lives unburdened by the weight of a dukedom. He tried to picture Lady Beatrice, a pleasant enough face, he supposed, framed by curls of the finest gold, but her conversation was a flat, predictable landscape of weather and fashion. He imagined a life with her, a series of lavish, empty rooms, polite conversations that never touched the soul, a marriage that was a business transaction witnessed by God and society. The thought was a leaden weight in his stomach, then unbidden, another face swam before his mind's eye. Ilara Thornfield. He saw the intelligent light in her eyes as she debated political theory, the way her brow would furrow in genuine thought, the unexpected smile that transformed her entire countenance when she made a point that delighted her. Their conversations were not transactions. They were explorations. With her, he felt not like a duke fulfilling a duty, but like a man, fully seen and challenged. The memory of their walk in the park, the accidental brush of her hand, sent a pang of longing through him, so sharp it was almost physical. He compared the cold, hard currency of Lady Beatrice's coal mines to the priceless, vibrant wealth of Ilara's intellect, and the comparison left him feeling hollow. The internal struggle was a silent war waged behind his impassive features. Duty, tradition, the very survival of his name demanded one path. His own heart, a organ he had long considered secondary to his title, pleaded for another. How could he trade a meeting of minds for a merger of accounts? How could he condemn himself to a life of quiet desperation for the sake of a crumbling estate? As if in answer to his torment, a sealed letter was brought in on a silver tray. The Blackwood crest stared up at him, pressed into dark wax. It was from his uncle, the head of the family council. Breaking the seal, Alistair read the brief, brutally direct lines. The council had been informed of the situation. Their patience was at an end. The line must be secured. He was to formally begin his courtship of Lady Beatrice by the season's end. There was to be no debate, no delay. It was not a suggestion, but an ultimatum. The letter fell from his fingers onto the desk, a single piece of paper that felt heavier than all the ledgers combined. The dilemma was no longer abstract. It was a cage, and the door had just been locked. The choice between economic survival and personal happiness had been made for him, and the cost of his title was to be his own heart. The Harrington soiree was the event of the season, a spectacle of such deliberate opulence that it seemed to defy the very concept of economic hardship. Crystal chandeliers blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, their reflections fracturing in the mirrored walls and glinting off the jewels adorning the assembled guests. The air was a heady mixture of perfume, champagne, and the low, excited hum of a society about to be fed a particularly juicy morsel of news. Ilara Thornfield moved through the throng like a ghost, her simple gown a whisper of grey silk against the cacophony of colour. She had come with a faint, foolish hope nestled beneath her breastbone, a hope that the past weeks of intellectual intimacy might have forged a bond strong enough to defy the cruel logic of the world. She found a vantage point near a potted fern, her eyes instinctively searching for the one face that mattered. When she found him, Alistair Blackwood was standing near the head of the room, his posture rigid. He was flanked by his family and the formidable presence of Lord and Lady Granville, parents of the radiant Lady Beatrice. Beatrice herself was a vision of gilded perfection, her smile practiced and serene, her hand resting lightly on Alistair's arm in a gesture that screamed possession. A cold dread, sharp and certain, began to crystallize in Ilara's veins. The host, Lord Harrington, tapped a spoon against his glass, and the room fell into an anticipatory hush. He made a brief, jovial speech about lineage, prosperity, and the fortunate unions that secured both. Then he turned with a theatrical flourish to the Duke. The moment stretched, taut and silent. Alistair's gaze swept the room, and for a fleeting second it locked with Ilara's. In that fragment of time, she saw not the confident nobleman, but a man trapped, his eyes holding a silent apology that was more devastating than any words. Then he looked away, his face becoming a mask of ducal propriety. He spoke, his voice clear and carrying, yet devoid of any warmth. He announced his engagement to Lady Beatrice Granville, speaking of honoured families and shared futures, of duty and legacy. The words were a formal public blade, expertly wielded. A wave of applause and congratulatory murmurs erupted, washing over Ilara like a physical force. She felt the blood drain from her face, a roaring in her ears, drowning out the noise. Yet through some miraculous act of will, her body did not betray her. She did not sway, she did not cry out. She simply stood, her hands clasped so tightly that her nails bit crescent moons into her palms, her expression a carefully neutral mask of polite interest. As the crowd surged forward to offer their blessings to the happy couple, Ilara turned and melted away from the celebration. She moved without seeing, her steps carrying her through an archway and into a deserted, dimly lit conservatory. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and night-blooming flowers. Only when she was certain she was alone, hidden behind a large frond of a tropical plant, did the dam break. The composure she had maintained with such effort shattered. A single, ragged sob escaped her lips, and then the tears came, hot and silent, streaming down her cheeks. She pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle any sound, her body trembling with the force of her quiet despair. Through the archway, the sounds of the party continued, the laughter, the music, the clinking of glasses. It was a celebration of a transaction, a ritual as cold and calculated as the ledgers that had necessitated it. Peering through the leaves, she watched Alistair. He accepted a handshake, his smile not reaching his eyes. He looked at Beatrice, but his gaze was distant, as if he were already miles away. In that moment, Ilara understood the profound cruelty of the marriage of convenience. It was not just the shattering of her own fragile dreams. It was the entrapment of two souls in a gilded cage, a life sentence of polite misery served in drawing rooms and ballrooms, forever bound by a contract that valued fortune over feeling and legacy over love. Her tears were not only for herself, but for the man who had just sold his future for the sake of his past, and for the hollow victory echoing through the glittering room. The world had shrunk to the four walls of her modest rented room, a space that now seemed to echo with a silence more profound than any she had ever known. The journey home from the Harrington soiree was a blur of rain-streaked windows and the hollow clatter of carriage wheels on cobblestones, a funeral procession for a dream that had never truly been allowed to live. Now, in the grey light of dawn seeping through the single window, Ilara Thornfield faced the aftermath. The gilded spectacle of the ball, the crushing weight of the announcement, the sting of her own tears in the conservatory. It all felt like a fever dream, yet the ache in her chest was brutally, undeniably real. It was a hollowed-out feeling, as if the hope she had nurtured had been surgically removed, leaving behind only a cold, empty cavity. For days, she moved through her life as an automaton. She took her meals without tasting them, turned the pages of books without absorbing the words. The vibrant world of ideas she had built with Alistair now felt like a taunt, each remembered conversation a fresh incision. She had not just lost a potential suitor, she had lost the one person who had made her feel that her mind was not a liability, but a gift. The cruelty of it was not merely in the rejection, but in the brief, beautiful illusion of being seen for who she truly was, only to have that vision dismissed as irrelevant in the final calculation. She mourned not only the man, but the future they had tacitly imagined, a partnership of intellect, a life of shared curiosity. Its ashes were all that remained, a fine grey powder that settled over everything. But as the first, raw wave of grief began to recede, something else stirred in the emptiness. A slow, stubborn ember of defiance. Lying in bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, she replayed the final scene. She saw Alistair's trapped eyes, the mask of duty he had been forced to wear. His choice had been a testament to the very system she despised, a system that valued bloodlines and bank balances over character and capability. It was a system that constrained women like her to the margins, their aspirations deemed inconsequential. If she allowed this blow to break her, she would be proving that system right. She would be confirming that a woman of her station had no right to dream beyond a good marriage, and when that failed, she had no purpose at all. The thought was intolerable. She would not be a victim of circumstance. She would not spend her life as a ghost, haunting the edges of a society that had no place for her. The ashes of her hope would become the soil for something new, something that belonged entirely to her, an independent life. The phrase, once a terrifying abstraction, now became a lifeline. She had no fortune, but she had her intellect. She had her pen, rising from her bed with a resolve that felt both fragile and fierce. She went to her small writing desk. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, the blank whiteness a challenge. What did she know? She knew the sharp sting of being dismissed for lack of fortune. She knew the quiet despair of having one's ambitions circumscribed by gender. And she knew, with a burning certainty, that the only true path to change was through the mind. If women were ever to be more than decorative accessories or bargaining chips, they needed to be educated. They needed to be taught to think. Her hand, which had trembled with sorrow only hours before, now steadied. She dipped her pen in the inkwell, the scratch of the nib the only sound in the quiet room. She began to write, not a diary entry of heartbreak, but a manifesto. The title formed in her mind before it flowed onto the page, on the necessity of intellectual cultivation for the female sex. The words came slowly at first, then in a gathering rush. She wrote of wasted potential, of the societal loss in keeping half its population ignorant. She argued not for radical upheaval, but for simple fundamental reason, that an educated woman made a better wife, a better mother, a better member of society. It was a strategic argument, one designed to appeal to the very men who upheld the system, by framing female education as an asset to that system, not a threat. As she wrote, the hollow ache in her chest began to fill with a new, different fire. This was not the warm, hopeful flame of romantic love, but the clear, hot burn of purpose. Each sentence was a brick in the foundation of a new life, a life built not on the approval of a duke or the whims of society, but on the unshakable ground of her own convictions. The dream of a shared future with Alistair was gone, reduced to ashes. But from those ashes, Ilara Thornfield was beginning to build a fortress of her own making, with her pen as her trowel and her resilience as its cornerstone. The scratch of a pen had become the sound of a new life being built, word by deliberate word. The months that had passed since the Harrington soiree were not a period of fading into obscurity, as society might have expected of a gently bred woman with a bruised heart and thin pockets. Instead, they had been a season of quiet, furious creation. Ilara Thornfield's small, rented room had transformed from a place of mourning into a command center for a quiet revolution. The essays she had begun in the ashes of her despair had found their way, through a carefully cultivated connection with a sympathetic printer, into the hands of London's more progressive thinkers. Published under the discreet pseudonym A Daughter of Reason, her arguments for female education had sparked murmurs in intellectual circles, a testament to the power of a clear voice speaking an inconvenient truth. That voice now had a physical manifestation. With the modest but growing proceeds from her writing and the patronage of a few enlightened ladies who admired her courage, Ilara had established the Thornfield Foundation for the Industrious Poor. Its mission was simple, yet radical, to provide not just alms, but practical education and vocational training for impoverished women. It was housed in a modest building in a less fashionable part of the city, its rooms smelling of clean linen, ink, and determined hope. Here, amidst the hum of sewing machines and the soft recitation of lessons in grammar and arithmetic, Ilara found a purpose that dwarfed her personal sorrow. She was no longer a spectator on the periphery of society. She was an architect of change, her days filled with the tangible results of her resolve. The respect she garnered in these circles was earned, not inherited, and it felt more substantial than any title. It was this newfound respect that earned her an invitation to a lecture at the Lyceum Hall, a gathering place for philosophers and social reformers. The topic was the moral imperative of reform, and the hall was filled with the usual mix of earnest intellectuals, curious students, and a smattering of fashionable attendees who considered radical thought a thrilling diversion. Ilara took a seat near the back, observing the crowd with a calm detachment that would have been impossible for her a year prior. She listened as the speaker, a well-known academic, delivered a competent but dry disquisition on abstract principles. During the question period that followed, a gentleman in the audience posed a challenge, questioning the practicality of applying such lofty ideals to the grim realities of the London poor. The speaker faltered, retreating into theoretical jargon. A silence fell, pregnant with intellectual disappointment. Then a woman's voice, clear and steady, cut through the stuffy air. It was Ilara. Without rising, without any theatricality, she spoke. She did not address the theory, but the practice. She spoke of the women who came to her foundation, their hands calloused from factory work, their minds hungry for knowledge. She described the transformative power of teaching a woman to read a lease agreement, to keep her own accounts, to see herself as more than a beast of burden. Her words were not polished oratory, but they carried the weight of lived experience and unwavering conviction. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Who was that woman? The one who ran the charity for factory girls. The admiration in the glances directed her way was not for her gown or her connections, but for the formidable intelligence and compassion she projected. She had taken a dry academic debate and rooted it in the soil of human necessity. When she finished, a quiet, genuine applause broke out, different in tone from the polite clapping that had greeted the main speaker. In that moment, Ilara felt a surge of confidence that was entirely her own. It was not borrowed from a man's attention or dependent on society's approval. It was forged in the fires of adversity and honed by action. She had challenged a room full of learned men not with defiance, but with simple, undeniable truth, and in doing so, she had claimed a power that no engagement announcement could ever bestow or revoke. The norms of her world had tried to break her. Instead, she was learning beautifully and powerfully how to bend them. The literary salon at Mrs. Chiltern's was a different world from the glittering ballrooms of the previous season. Here the opulence was intellectual, the currency ideas. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and the air hummed not with the rustle of expensive silk, but with the low, earnest murmur of debate over poetry and political tracts. For Ilara, these gatherings had become a second home, a sanctuary where her mind was her sole passport. Dressed in a simple gown of deep green that complemented her quiet confidence, she moved through the clusters of guests with an ease that was born of hard-won self-possession. She was discussing a recent essay on educational reform with a small group of fellow philanthropists when a shift in the atmosphere at the room's entrance caused her to glance up. The air seemed to still, the way it does when a predator enters a peaceful glade. There, framed in the doorway, was the Duke of Blackwood, and on his arm, glowing with the untouchable serenity of vast wealth and social certainty, was his wife, Lady Beatrice. The sight was a physical blow, a sudden, brutal yank back into a past she had worked so diligently to transcend. Alistair looked every inch the Duke, his posture erect, his attire impeccable, yet there was a tension in his jaw, a stiffness in his bearing that spoke of a man performing a role rather than inhabiting it. His eyes, those same intelligent eyes that had once sparkled in conversation with her, scanned the room with a weary disinterest that vanished the moment they found her. The recognition was instantaneous and mutual. For a suspended second, the crowded room fell away, leaving only the two of them locked in a silent, strained acknowledgement of all that had been and all that could never be. Then the moment broke. The current of the salon swept them inevitably toward one another, a social eddy that demanded polite interaction. They met near a bookshelf dedicated to the Greek philosophers, an ironically fitting backdrop for a meeting fraught with unspoken tragedy. The pleasantries they exchanged were brittle, hollow shells of words. Alistair inquired after her health. Ilara congratulated him on his marriage. Lady Beatrice stood slightly apart, her smile a perfect polished curve that did not reach her coolly assessing eyes. She offered a compliment on the success of the Thornfield Foundation, her tone suggesting a faint surprise that such a thing could be managed by a woman of Ilara's background. The underlying tension was a palpable force, a chasm of unsaid things that gaped between them, the memory of a walk in the park, the echo of a devastating announcement, the ghost of a connection severed by cold necessity. But as the strained conversation limped forward, something shifted in Alistair's gaze. He was not looking at the woman he had jilted, but at the woman she had become. He observed the calm authority with which she held herself, the intelligent light in her eyes as she deftly turned the conversation from personal trivialities back to the Foundation's work. He listened as she spoke about the practical challenges and triumphs, her words revealing a mind that was not only sharp, but strategic, compassionate, and resilient. This was not the hopeful, slightly vulnerable girl he had conversed with at balls. This was a woman of substance and purpose, her poise unshaken by his presence or the silent disapproval of his wife. The realization struck him with the force of a revelation. The intelligence that had first drawn him to her had not been crushed by his rejection. It had been tempered and strengthened, forged in the fires of adversity into something formidable and entirely her own. In the gilded cage of his own making, he felt a profound and unexpected pang of loss, not for what had been, but for what had persisted and flourished without him, a true connection that had been based on something far more enduring than social convenience. The London Library was a cathedral of quiet, its vastness broken only by the soft rustle of turning pages and the distant, respectful tread of patrons on the thick carpet. Sunlight streamed through the high arched windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced like tiny, slow-moving galaxies in the tranquil air. For Ilara, it was a sanctuary, a place where the world's clamor faded into a reverent hush, and the only voices were those printed on the endless rows of leather-bound spines. She was deep in the philosophy section, her fingers tracing the gilded letters of a controversial new treatise on social contract theory, a book that had set the intellectual circles ablaze with its radical propositions. So absorbed was she in weighing its arguments against her own experiences that she did not hear the approaching footsteps until a shadow fell across the page. She looked up, and her breath caught in her throat. Alistair Blackwood stood before her, his expression one of genuine, unguarded surprise. He held a copy of the very same book, its dark cover a mirror of the one in her hands. For a long moment, they simply stared at one another, the memory of their strained encounter at the salon hanging between them like a ghost. But here, in this temple of thought, the rigid formalities of the outside world seemed to dissolve. There was no Lady Beatrice, no watching society, no titles to uphold, only two minds and a shared provocative text. He gestured weakly to the book she held, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded, a small, hesitant gesture, and he moved closer, his presence both familiar and unsettling. He spoke first, his voice low, meant for her ears alone, expressing his astonishment at finding her engaged with such a contentious work. The initial awkwardness quickly melted away, replaced by the old, irresistible current of intellectual curiosity. He pointed to a particular passage, one that argued for the dissolution of hereditary privilege, and voiced his own conflicted reaction, torn between the logic of the argument and the weight of his own inheritance. Ilara responded not as a subject to a duke, but as an equal to an equal. She spoke of the treatise's idealism, acknowledging its power while pointing out its practical failings, her critique sharpened by her work with the women at her foundation. She had seen firsthand how abstract theories broke against the hard rocks of poverty and tradition. The conversation, once begun, flowed with an ease that astonished them both. It was as if the intervening months of pain and separation had been merely an interlude, and they were back in the alcove of that first ball, two souls connecting across a chasm of social expectation. The guarded tension of their last meeting evaporated, replaced by the pure, undiluted pleasure of a meeting of minds. Alistair was utterly captivated anew. He watched the way her eyes lit with passion as she debated, the graceful movements of her hands as she emphasized a point, the quick, intelligent smile that appeared when he challenged her. This was the Elara he remembered but refined, her intellect burnished to a brighter gleam by hardship and purpose. He found himself arguing not to win, but to prolong the exchange, to bask in the clarity of her thought. They delved into the philosophical implications of duty versus desire, of inherited obligation versus earned merit, each point and counterpoint weaving a new thread into the bond that had never truly been severed. At one point, he posed a particularly convoluted hypothetical about the nature of obligation, a question so abstract it bordered on the absurd. Elara considered it for a moment, her head tilted, and then a low, genuine laugh escaped her, a sound of pure, unforced amusement that seemed to startle even her. It was not a mocking laugh, but one of shared folly at the ridiculous complexities humans invented for themselves. After a beat of surprise, Alistair found himself joining in, a real heartfelt chuckle that softened the lines of care around his eyes. The shared laughter in the quiet library was a moment of profound connection, a brief, sunny clearing in the tangled forest of their circumstances. In that instant, the foundation of their relationship was laid bare once more, not in stolen glances or societal potential, but in the simple, powerful truth of intellectual equality. He was not drawn to a memory, but to the vibrant, formidable woman standing before him, whose mind was the greatest fortune he had ever encountered, and whose loss felt in that moment more acute than ever. The quiet sanctuary of the London Library could not hold back the tide of the world forever. The ease of that unexpected reunion, the rekindled spark of intellectual companionship, had been a private balm. But in the harsh light of society's ballrooms and drawing rooms, it quickly became a liability. Whispers, once confined to the fringes of gossip, began to coalesce into a distinct and damning narrative. It started as a raised eyebrow at another soirée, where the Duke of Blackwood was observed lingering a moment too long after exchanging pleasantries with Miss Thornfield. It grew into pointed remarks about the frequency of their chance encounters. Their heads bent together in earnest discussion while the glittering world swirled around them, oblivious to everything but the scandal of it all. The gossip did not simply float on the air. It had a face and a name, Lady Beatrice. Initially secure in her position as the Duchess, she had viewed Elara with a kind of detached, almost bored pity. But as the whispers reached her ears, polished and sharpened by concerned friends, that pity curdled into a cold, watchful jealousy. She began to notice the subtle shift in her husband when Elara was near, the way his guarded posture relaxed, the light that returned to his eyes, the attention he paid to her words that he never afforded to his wife's. Beatrice's jealousy was not the hot, passionate kind born of love, but the icy, possessive kind born of pride and social standing. She saw Elara not as a rival for a heart she had never truly sought to win, but as a threat to the impeccable facade of her marriage, a smudge on the pristine surface of her triumph. Elara felt the weight of those watchful eyes. Criticism, once directed at her ambitious charity work, now took on a sharper, more personal edge. She was no longer just an eccentric bluestocking. She was a temptress, a woman of questionable morals, leveraging her intellect to ensnare a married man. Former supporters of the Foundation murmured their disapproval, suggesting a discreet withdrawal of patronage for the sake of propriety. At a charity bazaar, a woman she had considered an ally turned a shoulder to her with a frosty silence that was more cutting than any insult. Ilara faced it all with a spine of steel, her head held high. She refused to cower or to alter her routine, understanding that to do so would be an admission of guilt. Her purpose was her armor. The women who depended on her foundation were her cause, and she would not abandon them for the sake of malicious tongues. The whispers culminated in a more public, more permanent form. A weekly society gazette, known for its thinly veiled insinuations, published a short article tucked between announcements of upcoming balls and reviews of the opera. It did not name names, but the description was unmistakable. It spoke of a certain philanthropic lady of modest birth and a nobleman of the highest rank, recently wed, whose intellectual sympathies were causing quite a stir and leading to unfortunate speculation. The article clucked its tongue over the dangers of excessive education for women, suggesting it led to ambitions beyond their station and a disregard for the sacred bonds of matrimony. The power of societal judgment, once a diffuse pressure, was now printed in stark black and white, a tangible weapon aimed directly at her reputation and her livelihood. Yet as Ilara read the cheap newsprint, her hand remained steady. The article did not shame her. It solidified her resolve. It was proof that her very existence, her refusal to be silenced or sidelined, was a threat to the established order. And a threat, she knew, was sometimes the first sign of real change. The article in the Gazette was a poisoned dart, but its intended victim had developed an immunity. Ilara read the insinuations not as a personal attack, but as a testament to the potency of her work. The Foundation, however, had no such immunity. The whispers and the printed scorn had a chilling effect that extended beyond drawing room snubs. A promised donation from a prominent family was quietly withdrawn, the note citing shifting priorities. Another patron, a merchant's wife who had been a vocal supporter, sent a terse letter ending her subscription, the ink blotted with what might have been embarrassment or fear of association. The Thornfield Foundation, a fledgling enterprise built on passion and precarious funding, faced the very real threat of being starved into oblivion by the very society it sought to improve. Ilara sat in the small, dusty office at the back of the Foundation's building. The ledgers spread before her like a patient's grim prognosis. The numbers were stark. The rent was due. The part-time instructor needed paying, and the supplies for the upcoming literacy class were a cost she could no longer comfortably cover. The scent of old paper and floor polish, usually so comforting, now smelled of anxiety. She was contemplating which essential to sacrifice when a discreet knock sounded at the door. Her assistant handed her a sealed letter, its paper of a quality so fine it felt like a whisper against her skin. There was no crest, no return address, but she knew the handwriting instantly. Her heart gave a single hard thud against her ribs. The note was brief, its wording cautious, as if the author feared the words themselves might be intercepted and used as evidence. It expressed admiration for the Foundation's work with the city's factory women, a cause the writer knew to be both noble and difficult. It mentioned a desire to support such efforts, away from the prying eyes of society, and proposed a meeting to discuss a specific project, establishing a small lending library and reading room within the Foundation's walls, dedicated to practical texts for working women. It was signed only with the initial A. The offer was a lifeline, but one tangled with peril. To accept Alistair's help was to pour fuel on the fire of gossip, to risk the very scandal the Gazette had hinted at. Yet to refuse was to let the women who depended on her down, to allow the judgment of the idle to cripple a tangible good. Her decision was swift. The cause was greater than her reputation. She sent a reply, equally discreet, agreeing to meet. Their collaboration began in that same dusty office, the air thick with unspoken history and the more immediate scent of ink and old wood. He arrived alone, dressed not in ducal finery, but in clothes that were well-made yet subdued, as if trying to blend into the walls. There was no small talk, no reference to the Gazette or the tensions that simmered outside. They went straight to work, their shared focus a bulwark against the complexities of their situation. He had done his research, presenting detailed notes on potential texts, from basic primers to books on domestic economy and workers' rights. She countered with her practical knowledge of what the women actually needed and could understand. Her insights born from hours of listening to their struggles. They worked side by side at her small desk, their heads bent over lists and floor plans. The space was so confined that their sleeves occasionally brushed, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt of awareness through them both, a silent reminder of the connection that underpinned the practicalities. He handled the logistics of discreetly acquiring the bookshelves. She organized the volunteer schedule. He argued for the inclusion of a few volumes of poetry for the nourishment of the soul. She insisted on a prominent section for legal guides and arithmetic textbooks for the protection of the purse. It was a true partnership, a meeting of his resources and her vision, his access and her expertise. In the quiet concentration of that room, surrounded by the quiet hum of the charity's daily work just beyond the door, something profound solidified between them. This was not the intellectual flirtation of a ballroom or the fraught tension of a society event. This was the gritty, unglamorous work of building something meaningful. She saw not a duke constrained by duty, but a man capable of quiet diligence and genuine compassion. He saw not a woman wronged by society, but a leader of unshakable integrity and profound strength. Their bond, once based on shared thought, was now fortified by shared action. They were not just challenging conventions through conversation. They were doing it with bookshelves and bookkeeping. With every volume they placed on a shelf, offering a silent, defiant challenge to a world that believed women like her should be seen and not heard, and that men like him should look the other way. In the dust of that small office, they were building more than a library. They were laying the foundation for a different kind of world, one book at a time. The ducal carriage rattled through the rain-slicked London streets, but Alistair Blackwood was oblivious to its motion. He sat in the oppressive silence, the only sound the rhythmic tap of his signet ring against the window frame, a nervous percussion to the symphony of his regret. He had just come from another interminable evening at his own table, a performance of marital harmony for a select group of guests. The silver had gleamed, the wine had flowed, and Lady Beatrice had been the picture of graceful hostessship, her conversation a placid stream of trivialities. He had played his part, the attentive Duke, but inside he had been screaming. The grandeur of Blackwood House, a monument to his lineage, felt like a mausoleum. Each richly appointed room, a chamber sealing him away from life itself. Later, in the suffocating quiet of his private study, a different kind of silence descended. It was not the absence of sound, but the presence of emptiness. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the portraits of his ancestors, their stern faces judging his misery. He had saved his estate, secured his line, and in doing so he had entombed his own soul. The wealth that surrounded him, the gilded frames, the mahogany desk, the vast acreage represented on the map behind him, was as insubstantial as smoke. It could not warm the cold spot in his chest where hope used to reside. It could not fill the hollow echo of his wife's polite, passionless conversation. He had chosen a life of gilded stability and found it to be a living death. Seeking a distraction from his thoughts, he picked up a recent issue of the London Review, a journal favored by the city's intellectuals. He flipped through the pages without interest until a name caught his eye, listed in the contents, On the Moral Compass of Charity, by E. Thornfield. His breath hitched. He turned to the page with a hand that was not quite steady. The essay was a revelation. It was not a dry philosophical tract, but a powerful, deeply felt argument woven from personal experience. Elara wrote of the women she served not as objects of pity, but as individuals of resilience and dignity. She spoke of charity not as a duty of the upper classes, but as a mutual compact of respect. Her prose was clear, compassionate, and fiercely intelligent, every sentence a testament to the mind he had so foolishly cast aside. She wrote of the emptiness of mere arms without genuine understanding, and as he read, the words seemed to pierce directly into the heart of his own predicament. He had given his name and fortune to a marriage that was the societal equivalent of alms, a transaction devoid of the essential nutrient of love. He had everything the world valued, and it was worth nothing. The dam of his self-control broke. He could not bear the silence of the house a moment longer. Throwing on a greatcoat over his evening clothes, he strode out into the night, the cool rain a welcome shock against his fevered skin. His footsteps carried him not aimlessly, but with a desperate purpose to the one person he trusted, Charles Whitaker, an old university friend who lived a life of quiet scholarship, far from the machinations of high society. Charles's study was a comforting chaos of books and papers, smelling of pipe tobacco and leather. He took one look at Alistair's rain-streaked, haunted face and wordlessly poured 2 glasses of brandy. Alistair did not sit. He stood before the fire, the words tumbling out in a raw, unvarnished confession. He spoke of the crushing weight of his duty, the cold perfection of his marriage, and the profound, aching emptiness that had become his constant companion. He confessed his every interaction with Elara, from the library to their secret collaboration, laying bare the rekindled connection that now felt like his only tether to sanity. "I was a fool, Charles," he said, his voice thick with self-loathing. "I thought I was buying security, a future. I bought a beautifully furnished prison. I chose a fortune over a foundation. I see her now, what she has built from nothing, the life of purpose she leads, and I preside over dust and echoes." He confessed his realization, born from reading her words, that Elara was not a memory of a lost chance, but his true love, the only person who had ever made him feel truly alive. The thematic emptiness of his wealth without her love was a chasm that had opened beneath his feet, and he was falling. Charles listened without interruption, his expression one of deep sympathy. When Alistair finally fell silent, spent and shaking, his friend spoke softly. "Regret is a bitter tonic, Alistair, but the realization that pours it is the first step toward a cure. What will you do?" Alistair looked into the flames, seeing not fire, but the clear, intelligent light in Elara's eyes. The indecision that had plagued him for months was gone, burned away in the crucible of his despair. A new resolve, hard and sharp, settled in its place. He had spent a lifetime upholding expectations, preserving a legacy. It was time to confront the gravest mistake of that life. He could not continue this charade. He had to face the consequences of his choice and the woman he had wronged. The path ahead was fraught with scandal and ruin, but any ruin was preferable to the living death of his present. He had realized the truth, and that realization demanded action. The grand drawing room of Blackwood House was a masterpiece of cold elegance, a space designed to impress rather than to welcome. Gilt-framed portraits of stern ancestors stared down from walls papered in deep crimson, and every piece of furniture was arranged with a precision that forbade comfort. The air was still and heavy, with the scent of beeswax and dried rose petals, a funerary sweetness that seemed to cling to the very atmosphere of Alistair's marriage. He stood by the fireplace, his back to the room, staring into the empty grate as if seeking answers in the cold ashes. The resolve that had solidified in Charles's study still burned within him, a hot, bright coal against the pervasive chill of his home. He did not hear her enter. So accustomed was he to the silent, gliding movements of his wife. It was her voice, sharp and clear as shattering crystal, that broke the silence. "This charade has reached its conclusion, Alistair." He turned slowly. Lady Beatrice stood in the center of the room, a vision of icy perfection in a gown of silver-grey silk. Her posture was rigid, her hands clasped tightly before her, but her eyes held a fire he had never seen in them before, a cold, furious blaze. "I'm afraid I do not take your meaning." "Beatrice," he said, his voice carefully neutral, though his heart had begun a hard, rhythmic pounding against his ribs. "Do not insult my intelligence," she countered, her tone dripping with the disdain that had been simmering for months. "Your absences, your distracted air, your preoccupation. The entire city whispers of your attachment to that Thornfield woman. Do you think me a fool? Do you think I have not seen how you come alive in her presence, a vitality you never afford your own wife?" The accusation hung in the air, stripping away the last pretense of their civility. Alistair did not deny it. To do so would be another lie in a marriage built upon them. Instead, he met her gaze, his own filled with a weary honesty that seemed to infuriate her further. "My interactions with Miss Thornfield are related to a charitable cause," he stated, though the words sounded feeble even to his own ears. "Charity." She spat the word as if it were a curse. "Is that what you call it? Your emotional neglect, your utter indifference to me and to this union. This is the charity you offer your Duchess. You pledge me your name and your position, but you have withheld everything else. You have given that woman your mind, your attention, the very essence of yourself, while I am left with the hollow shell of a duke." The heated argument erupted then, no longer a skirmish, but a full-scale battle. Voices, usually so carefully modulated for society, rose in the opulent room. He spoke of the suffocating expectations that had forced his hand, the duty that felt like a chain. She derided his weakness, his sentimentality, his failure to uphold the simple, cold bargain they had both entered. The superficiality of their marriage was laid bare, not as a quiet understanding, but as a festering wound finally lanced, in a moment of stunning clarity. Beatrice's anger seemed to crystallize into something even more chilling, a cold, profound dismissal. Her face, so often a mask of placid beauty, contorted into a sneer of pure contempt. "You speak of love as if it were a real currency," she said, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "It is a fiction for poets and fools. This marriage was never about that. It was about merging power, securing legacies. I brought you a fortune to save your crumbling estate. You gave me a title to elevate my bloodline. That was the transaction. I have held up my end. Your failure to find contentment in our perfectly arranged bargain is a defect in your character, not a flaw in our contract." Her words were a brutal revelation. For Alistair, the marriage had been a prison of his own making, a source of constant private anguish. For Beatrice, it was simply a business arrangement that he was mismanaging by introducing messy, inconvenient emotions. She felt no betrayal of the heart, only an insult to her social standing and a breach of their unspoken terms. The consequences of the societal expectations that had bound them were now starkly apparent. He was trapped in a hell of feeling, while she was imprisoned in a fortress of cold logic, viewing his yearning for something more as a form of vulgar incompetence. The argument ended not with a shout, but with that cold dismissal. She turned her back on him, a final, unequivocal gesture. "Manage your attachments discreetly, Alistair. I will not have my name dragged through the mud by your maudlin infatuation. Fulfill your public duties as my husband. What you do in the shadows is your own affair, so long as you do not embarrass me." She swept from the room, leaving him alone amidst the oppressive grandeur. The confrontation was over, but it had changed everything. The gilded cage was now exposed as utterly barren, its lock opened not by a key, but by the sheer, unbridgeable emptiness between its two occupants. The path ahead, fraught with scandal though it was, now seemed not just desirable, but inevitable. The sky had been threatening violence all afternoon, a bruised purple canopy that finally tore open as Ilara hurried away from the Foundation's modest building. The rain did not fall so much as it was unleashed, a cold, driving deluge that turned the cobblestones to mirrors and soaked through her cloak in moments. She pulled the wet wool tighter, her head bowed against the stinging drops, her mind a whirlwind of the day's tensions, the dwindling funds, the lingering sting of the Gazette's article, and beneath it all, the persistent, treacherous warmth of a rekindled connection that promised only more complication. She sought the refuge of her lodgings, a desperate need for solitude and a cup of hot tea her only thoughts. She had just turned onto the quieter street where she lived, the sound of the rain, a roaring curtain that muffled the world, when a figure emerged from the shadowed entrance of a shuttered shop. He was hatless and without a greatcoat, his evening clothes plastered to his frame, his dark hair a sodden mess. Water streamed down his face, but it was the raw, desperate intensity in his eyes that made her stop dead, her heart lurching into a frantic, painful rhythm. Alistair Blackwood looked like a man who had fled a burning building, his usual composure utterly shattered. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other through the silver veil of the storm, the world reduced to the narrow, rain-lashed street. The space between them crackled with unspoken history, a chasm of lost time and present longing. Then he took a step forward, his voice cutting through the downpour, not with ducal authority, but with a hoarse, stripped-bare urgency. He did not offer pleasantries or excuses. The words poured out of him, a confession torn from the depths of his soul. He spoke of the gilded cage of his marriage, the profound, echoing emptiness that had become his life. He admitted his error with a brutal honesty that was more compelling than any polished apology, calling his choice to wed for wealth the greatest folly of his existence, a cowardly surrender to pressure that had cost him everything of true value. He spoke of reading her essays, of seeing the life of purpose she had built from the ashes of his betrayal, and the realization that had gutted him, that her intellectual companionship, her resilience, her very soul were the only fortune he had ever truly needed. The rain soaked them both, a great impartial leveller, but Ilara barely felt the cold. His declaration hung in the stormy air, a monumental risk that could topple dukedoms and shatter reputations. A maelstrom of emotions warred within her. Fear was the first, a sharp, instinctual terror of the scandal that would surely engulf them, a whirlpool that would drag down her foundation, her hard-won respect, everything she had built. It was a sensible, self-preserving fear, but rising against it was a wild, hopeful, terrifying joy. This was the acknowledgement she had never dared to hope for, the validation of a bond she had believed severed forever. He was offering her not just love, but a partnership of equals, an admission that her worth far exceeded any ledger's sum. She was torn, suspended between the safe, solitary path she had carved for herself and the dangerous, glorious precipice he was asking her to leap from with him. The fear of society's condemnation was a real and potent force, but as she looked at him, drenched, vulnerable, offering her his ruined honor and his whole heart, it began to pale against the profound emptiness of a life lived without risk. Without this specific, irreplaceable connection, he saw the conflict in her eyes, the tremble of her lip. He moved closer, the rain blurring the space between them until they were mere inches apart. His hand rose, hesitant, and his fingers, cold and wet, brushed a strand of soaked hair from her cheek. The touch was electric, a jolt that shattered her final defenses. It was not the gesture of a duke, but of a man stripped bare, asking for redemption. That was all it took. The fear did not vanish, but it was swallowed whole by a surge of feeling so powerful it stole her breath. Her own hand came up to cover his, where it rested against her face, her fingers icy against his skin. Her resolve, her independence, her carefully constructed walls, they crumbled into nothing. In answer to his declaration, she rose on her toes, her other hand gripping the sodden fabric of his sleeve for anchor, and closed the final distance between them. The kiss was not gentle. It was a collision of pent-up longing and desperate relief, a passionate embrace that was as much a battle as a surrender. The rain poured down, washing over them, a chaotic baptism. In that moment, the past and the future fell away. There was no society, no scandal, no titles or foundations. There was only the fierce, undeniable truth of their connection, a redemption found not in safety, but in the glorious, terrifying risk of choosing each other, come what may. The storm raged around them, but within their embrace they had found their only calm. The storm of their reunion had passed, leaving in its wake a world washed clean and charged with terrifying possibility. The clandestine meetings and discreet letters that followed were not the stuff of furtive affair, but the practical, determined architecture of a new life. Alistair, his resolve hardened by the emptiness of his gilded cage, moved with a purpose that surprised even himself. He did not skulk or hide. He engaged a solicitor of unimpeachable discretion. The negotiations with Beatrice were not a battle, for she had already declared her terms. They were a transaction of a different sort, an unwinding of a contract that had served its cold financial purpose for her. She desired freedom as much as he did, though for different reasons. Hers was a freedom to enjoy the status of a duchess, unencumbered by a husband's inconvenient emotions. The separation was arranged with a chilling amicability, a testament to the utter lack of heart in their union. It was a quiet scandal, contained within legal documents and the hushed circles of the highest society, but a scandal nonetheless. The Duke of Blackwood was formally, if not yet publicly, a free man. Their wedding was a mirror opposite of the grand announcement that had shattered Ilara's heart. There was no ballroom, no glittering assembly, no proud families. It took place in a small, sun-dappled chapel in the countryside, attended only by Charles Whittaker and a handful of Ilara's most steadfast friends from her charitable work. Ilara wore a simple dress of cream silk, its elegance and its lack of pretense. Alistair's gaze, as he watched her walk toward him, held none of the trapped despair of his previous engagement. It was filled with a quiet, profound certainty. They spoke their vows not as a duke and a woman of modest birth, but as Alistair and Ilara, two souls pledging not to merge fortunes or lineages, but to share a life of the mind and the heart. The disapproval of the world they had left behind was a distant thunder on a clear day, unable to touch the sanctity of the moment. Society, of course, did not remain silent for long. When the news broke, it was a feast for the gossips. The Duke had thrown away a brilliant match for a bluestocking with a charity. It was madness, a scandal of the highest order. They were whispered about in drawing rooms, caricatured in pamphlets, and quietly cut by those who valued propriety above authenticity. But a curious thing happened. The scorn aimed at them seemed to slide off the new life they were building together. They had chosen each other, and in that choice they had found an impregnable fortress. Their happiness was not found in society's approval, but in the quiet rhythm of their days. Their home became a sanctuary of shared curiosity, its rooms filled with the scent of books and the sound of earnest debate. Theirs was an intellectual partnership that blossomed into a deep, abiding love. Each conversation a reaffirmation of the bond that had first drawn them together, the ultimate symbol of their union. The resolution of their tumultuous journey was not a grand estate or a ducal title, but the expansion of the Thornfield Foundation. It was renamed simply the Blackwood Foundation, a joint endeavor that represented the merging of their strengths. Alistair's resources and social acumen, once used to preserve a dying legacy, were now channeled into fostering new life and hope. Ilara's vision and compassion, once a solitary struggle, were now amplified by his unwavering support. Together, they opened a new wing dedicated not just to vocational training, but to a lending library and lecture hall, creating a true center for learning and empowerment. It was a new era, not just for them, but for the women whose lives they touched. The foundation stood as a living testament to their story, a triumph of authentic love and shared purpose over the hollow conventions of wealth and status. In the end, the greatest fortune was not inherited, but built together brick by brick, book by book, a lasting legacy not of blood, but of belief.